question or say anything that's personal, you want me to cut that out, just let me know and I'll edit it before I post these. Another thing I should say, so I'm mostly recording these for like people who are gone. They could also be used in future classes. Like if I have a fully online class, I could post them. I typically will probably post them to Canvas on Fridays. So Friday I'll spend some time kind of going through all the classes I've recorded all week, make edits if I need to, and then get those posted. Probably the way I'll do it is make like a YouTube playlist. That's worked pretty well in the past, and then there will just be a link on Canvas that will take you to that YouTube playlist where you can watch any of the videos of lectures you've missed, or if you just want to watch them again to review for quizzes and exams, you can do that as well. All right, if there aren't any other questions, then today we're going to be talking about research methods that are used in the field of psychology. And then we have a couple little activities that we'll work on after we get through the lecture portion. So a couple of kind of the main points that you should notice today throughout lecture. Number one is that psychology, as we talked about last time, is a very diverse field. There's all these different subfields, and because of that, there are lots of different research methods and approaches to research. And so today, there's no way for me to cover all of the approaches that are used in psychology. I'm just going to talk about some of the most common ones, the ones that we'll encounter the most frequently throughout the quarter. One kind of big piece that we'll focus on is the difference between what's called correlational research and experimental research. So correlational research is where you're basically just looking at the relationship between variables that already exist. That'll make more sense in a second if it doesn't already. Experimental research is where the researcher is actually controlling some aspect of the study. They're controlling some variable or changing something or manipulating something. And each of these approaches has their own strengths and weaknesses. They really complement each other. They're both very important in the field of psychology, in a lot of fields of science, but I think especially in psychology. So we'll talk a little bit more about that difference between those approaches. And then we're also going to take some time talking about the ethics in research in psychology. So there's a pretty poor history in psychology of doing some very unethical things. So we'll talk about some of that historical context. And then we'll talk about some of the kind of bodies that govern ethics in psychology today, kind of what the process is to make sure that a study is ethical by today's standards. So those are kind of the main things that we'll talk about throughout today's class. Okay, so just kind of some foundational stuff to get us started thinking about the way that research works. So there's, scientific process that is followed by pretty much anyone who's doing research in the field of psychology or any science. Some terms that you need to be familiar with have to do with different types of reasoning that we make whenever we're developing a research study or trying to interpret the results from that study. So these are deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. So with deductive reasoning, you're starting with a general premise or a general observation. And then you're trying to go from that general observation to something much more specific or something empirical. With inductive reasoning, it's the opposite direction. So you're starting with something specific and going to something much more general. So let me give you some examples because that always makes it a little bit easier to understand. So let's say that as, just from making observations in my own life, I'm interested in looking at the relationship between extroversion and music genre that a person likes. So let's say I've noticed that in my little group of friends, all of my friends who are really extroverted, they tend to really like pop music, and all my friends who are introverted don't really like pop music. So I've kind of made this observation that in that case is very specific. So I kind of hate that the thing just covers the whole board. I need boards other places. Can you guys see this one? Can everybody see this one pretty well, especially if I maybe move this box? Let's see how well I can reach it, right? Because it's in a weird place, but. Okay, so I'm starting with something specific in this case. So my friend is one person in the world, and they are extroverted, and they like pop music. So let's say from that very specific instance, I now want to make a general statement that everyone who's extroverted likes pop music. Okay? So I think, based on that observation, everyone who's extroverted likes pop music. So in that case, I'm starting with a specific instance, and I'm making a general claim based on that specific instance. So when you're going from specific to general, that's this half of the reasoning, that's called inductive reasoning. We could also go the opposite direction. So maybe I read in a textbook sometime that in general, people who are extroverted like pop music. So I have this general idea. And now I meet someone, I meet a new person who I notice is extroverted. Then I might come to the conclusion that, based on this general statement, I now know someone who's extroverted. This specific person must like pop music. So I'm going the opposite. I'm starting with general, and then I'm going back or making a conclusion to a specific instance based off of this general fact. So that would be deductive. Okay. So in the research process, we're using both of those in kind of this cyclical process. So we often will generate a hypothesis based off of a specific observation. I think particularly in psychology, because we're all people, we interact with people, we have lots of instances where we see examples and anecdotes from our own lives that are specific. Then we kind of, use those observations to come up with a hypothesis or a theory or an idea. But then it's really important to test that theory and to see if it applies to the general population, to see if it holds. And then we kind of go through this cycle of maybe we find it doesn't hold for some people. Why is that the case? Let's kind of refine our question, refine the process, and go from there. So everybody kind of understand the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. All right. So we're using all these processes to make a good theory. So just like in any other science and psychology, we're always starting with theories and then testing those theories to see how valid they are, to see if we need to change them or tweak them in some way and make them better. And it's important throughout this quarter that we stop and kind of think about what makes a good theory, and that we kind of ask that question repeatedly anytime we examine a theory in this class. So there's a few really important things that make a good theory. And I will say, too, a lot of times people use the word theory kind of colloquially, like just in your everyday conversations, and you might mean it in a very different way than the way that a scientist means it. So here I'm talking about the way that a scientist defines a theory is based off of these properties. So one really important thing about a good theory is that it has to be falsifiable. And what that means is that I have to be able to think of a way that I could prove my theory false if it was false. So if I had this theory that all extroverted people like pop music, I could pretty easily falsify that by just doing a simple survey. I could send out a survey to 1,000 people. I could try to measure how extroverted and introverted they are, and then I could ask them about their genre preferences of music, and I might find out that actually extroverted people do not like pop music. So that theory is pretty easily falsifiable. This kind of property of theory is one of the main things that separates science from religion. So there's nothing wrong with religion. I want to start by saying that. If you have religious beliefs, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The only thing is that it's not considered scientific because in general, religious ideas cannot be falsified. It's very difficult to prove that God does not exist, right? So if you believe that, totally fine. It's just not a scientific belief. It's a religious belief. So that's, one of the things that kind of separates those two philosophies or ways of thinking, I guess you could say. So good theory has to be falsifiable. In addition to that, it should fit all of the current data and observations that we have available. So if I already have a bunch of research looking at extroversion and genre preferences, then I should look at that data first before I come up with a theory. And when I'm coming up with that theory, I should try to make sure that it fits the data that we already have. If I read a bunch of studies and those studies say that extroversion has nothing to do with music genre preference, then it would be kind of silly of me to come up with a theory that says the opposite of what this data is already telling us. Another thing about a good theory is that it should make useful predictions. So it should help us to predict, in psychology at least, help us predict human behavior, help us predict, health outcomes, help us make some kind of predictions that we can then use to either better understand people or to help people or to move the field forward in some way. And then this final piece, it should be what's called parsimonious. Parsimonious just means that if we have, let's say we have two theories, and both of these theories so far fit all of these other criteria, They're both falsifiable, they both fit the data, they both make useful predictions, and let's say they're both about kind of like the same topic. But one of them is really simple, and one of them is really complex. Then we're gonna pick the more simple one. So parsimonious means that our theories should be as simple as they can be to fit all these other criteria. They should be as simple as they can be to be falsifiable, to fit all the data, and to make useful predictions. So we don't want to just come up with overly complex theories just to be complicated. So again, kind of as we're talking throughout the quarter, we might talk about different theories about, the causes of depression or something like that. I want you to always kind of have this list in the back of your head and think, is this theory falsifiable? Is it, fitting all the data that we have, etc. One other thing I might mention too about the idea of falsifiability, there are instances where someone might come up with a theory that in their current time with their current technology is not very falsifiable. But then later we might have technological developments that allow us to prove or disprove something that we couldn't before. So for example, if someone in the 1800s had a theory that whenever you're looking at faces, a certain part of your brain is active, people probably then would have said that's not a good theory because we can't falsify that, we can't look inside your head and see your brain activity. But now we have things like MRI that allow us to do that. So something that wasn't falsifiable in the 1800s might be falsifiable now. Any questions so far about what makes a good theory? Okay. So next, let's talk a little bit about some very specific approaches that are used in research in psychology. And again, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are lots of other methods that are used. Again, these are just some of the most common ones that you'll encounter throughout the quarter. So one type of approach to research is called a case study. A case study is basically where you find usually one individual, or you might have a very small group of similar individuals who have some kind of extreme or unique experience that is enlightening for one of our theories. For example, there might be someone who has had a really severe car accident and had very specific damage to a part of their brain that no one else has ever had before. And then maybe that person has some sort of really unique behavioral result because of that. So maybe they had damage to a part of their brain that makes it to where they can't remember their past experiences, but they can remember language and words and things like that. Okay, that's an actual case study that's been done. So we would basically take that one person who's had that really unique experience and probably use some of these other methods as well to kind of test their abilities, try to figure out what they can and can't do, and then draw conclusions from that. But the main thing with a case study, you're pretty much looking usually at one individual or maybe a very small number, you might have 3 or 4 people who all had kind of similar brain damage that you're looking at. Another approach to research, and again, some of these kind of overlap, so you shouldn't even necessarily think of them as totally separate, but they're just kind of different techniques or methods. One of them is the observational study. That one is pretty much in the name. With an observational study, you're basically just observing human behavior. There's kind of 2 ways to do it. One is what's called natural observation, where you pretty much just watch people in their natural environment. And you're not in any way interfering or having any hand in what's happening. So for example, if I wanted to study, let's say I'm interested in whether males or females are more likely to run a red light. Then I might just go stand at an intersection with a clipboard and just watch how many people run red lights and kind of mark off if they appear to me at least to be male or female. Probably not a great way to do that study. There's all kinds of issues with that, but that would be an observational study, and that would be natural observation. You could also do what's called a structured observation, which is where the researcher kind of sets up a little scenario and then watches what happens, watches what unfolds basically. So with a structured, I'm trying to think if there's a good way I could do that same study with a structured observation. It's kind of hard to think of one. I'd have to make the red light myself, make the intersection, somehow make the scenario unfold. There's probably better examples. So let's say, for example, I just used this example in developmental psych. I don't think any of you are in there. So I always get a little self-conscious because I have 3 classes throughout the week. and I'm often talking about the same things, and I have to stop and think, like, did I talk to this class about that, or was that another class? Don't know sometimes. So if I start repeating myself, I sound like a crazy person, just know it's probably because I think I told my other class this and not you guys. But you guys are not my developmental psych class, so that's fine. So let's say, for example, I wanted to look at like preschool children and their sharing behaviors. Like, how likely are they to share? And again, maybe I'm interested in like a gender difference. Are boy preschoolers more likely to share or girl preschoolers? Then I might set up a little scenario where I take, like 10 preschoolers and I give them 5 toys, and I see, how do they share those 5 toys amongst the 10 of them. So in that case, it's not really natural observation because I, as the researcher, have kind of come in and interacted with these children, given them the toy, and sort of made this little scenario. Okay, but either way, those would both be observational studies. We can also do behavioral studies. Behavioral studies are kind of similar to a structured observation. They're just maybe even more structured, I guess. So behavioral studies, you're usually making some kind of like experiment or task that a person has to complete. I did a lot of behavioral studies as a graduate student, but there are things that maybe you guys wouldn't realize relate to psychology. So as a graduate student, I studied visual perception, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks probably, and some of this stuff that I'm about to say will make more sense to you then. But I would do things like make experiments that were usually on a computer, where I would have like faces or objects that people had to look at and try to recognize, and usually they were manipulated in some way. So maybe the face would be like upside down, or maybe I would blur out the eyes, or like do different things to the face to make them harder or easier to recognize. And then they, on a computer have to like in some way indicate who the person is. So that would be a behavioral study. I'm basically sort of measuring their performance on a task. So behavioral studies often look kind of like tests of some nature. There's the really broad, types of studies you can do that are behavioral. So that one's pretty broad. But okay, another approach that's often used is what's called psychophysiological measures. This is where we're measuring things like maybe skin conductance or heart rate, or there's a lot of studies now that look at like pupillometry and eye tracking. So trying to track like how big your pupils get, in reaction to different stimuli, watching where your pupils or your eyes are going as you're looking at some scene or something like that. So we're measuring something that's physical, but that has like a psychological correlate to it. So those are often used in lots of different studies as well. Surveys, those are the ones you guys are probably maybe most familiar with. The survey is basically where you just send out some sort of questionnaire and have people answer it. You could do surveys, for example, on, like anxiety or depression or extroversion or introversion, or people's attitudes towards different music genres, or, like there's a million different things you can do a survey about. But survey, you're sending out either like paper or electronic, just a questionnaire that people are filling out themselves. I think it was this class where I very briefly talked about the idea of computer simulations, maybe. Does that sound vaguely familiar? When I was talking about like how computers helped us start to understand the mind a little bit better. So with computer simulations, you basically come up with a theory about something about how the mind works, and then you try to develop a computer algorithm that works the same way, and then you test, does that computer algorithm give you the same result as a person would if they're doing the same task? So kind of back to what I was saying with like the faces. Like maybe I have a theory about how humans recognize faces, then I might have some faces with eyes blurred out and different things done to it, see how well humans do recognizing those faces, and then run those through a face recognition algorithm, see if the face recognition algorithm does the same as the humans, and then kind of compare those results to try to find out if my theory is correct or if it needs to be like updated or changed. Okay, in developmental psychology specifically, there are studies that are techniques that are used called longitudinal and cross-sectional. Those are used to look at differences across like different age groups or different generations. So with a longitudinal study, you are taking a group of individuals and testing them on something. So you could use just about any of these other methods we talked about. So maybe you give a bunch of 10-year-olds a survey about their music preferences, and you find out what do 10-year-olds like to listen to. And then with a longitudinal study, you would then track those same children over time as they get older, So you would come back to those same group of kids whenever they're 12 or 14 or 20 or whatever, and ask them all the same questions about their music preferences and see if those have changed. So maybe 10-year-olds like more simplistic sort of pop music. As they get older into their 20s, maybe they like things that are maybe a little more complex and like diverse, for example. So that's longitudinal. You're tracking them across time. Cross-sectional is kind of similar, but you're doing the study all at once with different groups of people. So with a cross-sectional, you might have one group of 10-year-olds, you ask them their music preferences. At the same time, you have a different group of 20-year-olds, and you're asking them their music preferences, and then comparing the 10-year-olds to the 20-year-olds. That makes sense? Difference between longitudinal and cross-sectional? Okay. All right, I know it's a ton of information all at once. I'm gonna pause for a second. Any questions so far about the kinds of research that are used in psychology? Again, there's a lot of diversity there, so. Any approaches you've heard of, like maybe you've read, I don't know, articles or something online about some psych thing?
There's surveys all the time, like on Facebook. Have you seen an ad about blah, blah, blah
Yes.
last week?
Yes.
To see like how effective the advertisements are or something.
Yeah, I think surveys by far probably the most common approach that's used, partially because they're just so easy to do now. It's so easy to just like go online and make surveys for just about anything you can think of. And they are, yeah, very common for advertisers and like marketing. So, yeah. Any others of these that you've either encountered or any different ones that are not on my list that you know of?
You also hear about those case studies on the radio sometimes. Like,
Yes.
if you want to be part of a group of people that's testing a medication to help you quit smoking weed or whatever it is, you know, like you hear about those a lot.
Yes, yeah. All right. I feel like I'm already like thinking of others just as I'm looking at the list, but I've already given you a lot, so I'm not going to just start piling on more. So we'll stop there with the different approaches that are used. Okay, so kind of more broadly, so all those are very specific techniques or methods that a researcher might use when they're doing their study, and most of those were pretty specific to psychology. So now we're going to kind of zoom out and talk a little bit more broadly about two different approaches that you can take to doing research in general. And this is true of pretty much any science, not just psychology, but it applies, I think, to psychology pretty well. So the first approach to doing research is what's called correlational research. So correlational research is where you're looking at variables that already exist as they are, you're measuring them and trying to look at the relationships between them. So let's see, I have an example here. I was about to try to come up with one off the top of my head, but I've made one for myself already, so that's fine. Okay, so let's say we're looking at the correlation between childhood trauma and adult relationship issues. So we want to know if whenever you're a kid, you have traumatic experiences, does that affect your like intimate relationships as an adult? So if I wanted to do this as a correlational study, then basically what I would do is just probably a survey would be the easiest approach to doing this one. So I would give a survey to maybe 1,000 participants, and I just ask them about the traumas that they experienced as a childhood. Maybe I have like a checklist that has all the different traumas that I can think of, and they go through and they just check off all the ones that they've experienced, something like that. And then I also ask them some questions. Maybe I have like a relationship satisfaction survey. So a bunch of questions asking them, you know, how they feel about their current relationship. Do you feel fulfilled in your current relationship? Do you feel like you have good communication skills with your partner? Questions like that. Maybe I have like 10 questions that are kind of getting at that relationship satisfaction. And then I just look at the correlation between those two variables. And probably what I would find, based on past research, is that people who have had a lot of trauma, people who check lots of those check boxes, are probably going to be less satisfied in their adult relationships. Okay? So this would be a correlation because as the researcher, I'm not manipulating anything with my participants. I didn't cause their childhood trauma, hopefully. That would be a really terrible study if I did. So I didn't make the childhood trauma happen. I didn't make their relationship satisfactory or unsatisfactory. I just measured stuff that was already there and looked at the relationship between those variables. So that's a correlation. So correlational research is probably the most common because it can be done with surveys, so it's pretty easy to do. But the biggest weakness with doing correlational research is that it cannot determine what's called causality. So ultimately, as a researcher, what I'm almost always interested in is what causes something. Does X cause Y? Does Y cause X? Does Z cause X? I'm trying to figure out what causes something else to happen, like these cause and effect relationships. With the correlational research, I cannot answer that question. So let's say, like I said, we found childhood trauma correlates with bad relationships in the future. I might be tempted from that to say childhood trauma causes bad relationships later. But if it's correlational research, I cannot make that claim. Can anybody think of maybe other interpretations of childhood trauma correlating with adult relationship issues? What are some other things that could be going on there? There's no right or wrong answer here.
Bullying as a child and then as an adult experiencing.
Okay.
Friends,
Yeah.
whatever.
Let me kind of run with what you're saying
Yeah,
and see if
I
I can
can't
elaborate on it a
remember.
little bit. Yeah. So, and then I'll get to you in just a second. So let's say children who experience trauma, like maybe that trauma is typically coming from their parents, maybe their parents are abusive or neglectful or whatever, but maybe that makes them very like introverted and shy and like insecure, and so then the way that they interact with their peers results in them being bullied a lot. So then they're bullied, so then maybe because they're bullied, they don't form good relationships with their peers, so then as they grow up and they're trying to have intimate relationships, they're still not, they can't connect very well. So it wasn't the trauma that caused them to be bad at relationships. It was that trauma caused them to be bullied more, and then being bullied more caused them to have bad relationships. You know what I'm saying? So in that case, we can't make this direct line between trauma and bad relationships. There's this other thing that's going on. And there's actually a name for that. We call that the third variable problem whenever it comes to correlation. So whenever you're doing correlational research, there could always be some other variable that's involved that you haven't measured that's actually the causal relationship that's causing an issue there. It's Emmy, right?
Yeah.
Or M?
Emmy.
Okay.
It's kind of similar to what she said, but like how childhood trauma, like your relationship with your parents, how it correlates to like if you're in an abusive relationship, like when you're an adult, and like how the abuse is similar versus how it's different.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me see if I can kind of run with what you're saying. So you're saying that as a child, you might experience some version of abuse, and then in your adult relationships, you're trying to say that what you experienced there would be different, or it would be the same? Or it could be either?
Yeah, I mean, depends.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of similar to what she was saying. So yeah. Yeah.
Or like, if you had parents that like just chronically didn't get along and they had really poor communication skills and they were always yelling at each other, raising their voices, or like verbally arguing.
Right.
As a child watching that, you wouldn't form a good like communication skill set.
Right.
And so then as an adult, at any sort of inconvenience or, you know, like any sort of argument that could be even a small one,
Right.
your first instinct would be to, you know, yell or raise your voice or call names or whatever it
Yeah.
might be. You
Okay.
know.
Yeah. So I think kind of what you're saying again is a different third variable problem, but it's
Yeah.
it's a different one. So it's essentially like it's not the trauma itself that's causing the bad relationships, it's bad modeling.
Mhm.
Right, so you're modeling behavior that's not productive or helpful, and so then you carry that with you into a relationship, but it's not necessarily the trauma that was experienced, it's more just that you had like a bad example of what a relationship should look like, yeah. So all those would be considered third variable problems. So with any correlational research, that's one issue. Another one, this one I'm trying to like figure out a way to fit it to this example, and this example maybe isn't the best one to make it, but I'm gonna try. So another issue with correlation is you often don't know the direction of causation. So you don't know if X causes Y or if Y causes X. So with this one, like if I stretch this, I could say like, let's say I'm in a bad relationship as an adult, and maybe I didn't actually experience that much trauma as a child. Like maybe I had kind of a quote unquote normal level of trauma, whatever that is. But because I'm in a bad relationship, maybe my mindset is just very like negative, and I kind of have a negative frame of mind. So whenever I remember my childhood, all of my memories are going to be much more negative because of that. So I might remember lots of trauma, but I might be forgetting all the positive things because I'm in such a negative mindset from this abusive relationship I'm in now. So instead of the childhood trauma causing the bad relationship, my bad relationship in adulthood is causing me to view my childhood differently. So then now when I'm filling out this survey as an adult to try to answer these questions and come up with this correlation, the causal direction is actually backwards from what the researcher would think. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So again, with correlation, you sometimes don't know the direction. So I guess I could write those on the board maybe. So you have what's called the third variable problem. And then, let's see, the directionality problem is the name for the other one. I don't expect you to remember these names of things for like exam purposes or whatever, it just might help you kind of remember these different issues with correlational research. So you don't know if there's another variable, you don't know if X is causing Y or if Y is causing X. So there's, all these issues with correlational research. Because of this, we cannot determine causality. And yet, correlational research is still probably the most common research that's done, especially in psychology. One of the reasons is that it's really, it's very easy to do. Kind of like I talked about earlier, you can do correlational research very easily with surveys. And surveys are very easy and inexpensive to send out to lots of people, collect lots of data really quickly. And then you can also analyze it really quickly because it's already like in a survey. I can just put that in an Excel document, analyze it real quick, my study's done. So it's very logistically simple, is part of the reason it's done so much. Because of that, it's really good, I would say, for exploring new research ideas. So if I have a new hypothesis that no one else has really explored yet, and I'm not really sure if this hypothesis is going to be true or not, I probably don't want to invest a ton of time and resources into making an experiment that's going to be expensive and lots of labor, and then find out that actually my hypothesis is not true. So correlation is often a good first step to then do an experiment later. Also, there's all kinds of topics in psychology that would just be really unethical or impractical to do an experiment. So we're going to talk about an experiment in just a second, but the gist of it, like I already said, with an experiment, the researcher is manipulating something so that they can get at this cause and effect relationship. So if I wanted to do an experiment on childhood trauma and the effect it has on adulthood, I would basically have to choose, let's say I'm going to take 100 participants, I'm going to take 50 of these kids, and I'm just going to traumatize the heck out of them for their entire childhood. And the other 50, I'm going to let them have the most luxurious childhood they could imagine, and then I'm going to see how they develop as an adult. That's how I would do that as an experiment. Obviously, I can't do that ethically, even practically. It'd probably be difficult to traumatize 50 children for the length of period that you would need to. So yeah, just practically, ethically, you could not do that as an experiment. So you pretty much have to do it as a correlational study. That's the only way it can be done. So correlation is still important. It's still useful. It has its place. You just can't determine causality from it. So with experimental research, if it's done properly, experimental research should take care of these two problems. So with an experiment, like I said, researcher is controlling one variable. We call that the independent variable. So let's think of a new example where I could do an experiment that's not super unethical. Let's say I'm trying to develop a new antidepressant drug. So I want to test, oh wow, I just came up with that off the top of my head and it's already on my slide. I didn't look at it. So I remembered what I was thinking. That's good. Anyways, so yeah, I'm looking at two different antidepressant medications to see how they affect depression. So let's say I have kind of like the standard one. I don't know how much you guys know about depression, but like the standard thing that's used traditionally is something called SSRIs. You don't need to worry about what that means. Just know that that's an antidepressant. So let's say I make a brand new one, and I think my antidepressant is going to work a lot better than these traditional SSRIs, and I want to test that. So I would, in this case, do an experiment where I'm controlling a variable. The variable in this case would be which medication my patients get. So I would recruit maybe 100 people who have been diagnosed with depression. 50 of those people are going to get the standard SSRI. 50 of them are going to get my new medication that I created. And then we're going to measure how much their depression improves over time. So maybe we'll do this for like 6 weeks or something. They have their medication, they're taking it every day for 6 weeks. We measure their depression at the beginning, we measure their depression at the end, and we see if they've improved over the course of that 6 weeks. So first of all, that takes care of the directionality problem because I know what came first. I know that I gave them the medication when they were at some baseline level of depression, and then time passed, and then their symptoms improved. So with an experiment, because we're controlling the variable, we know X came before Y, so therefore X must cause Y. So that gets rid of this directionality problem. So for the third variable problem, this one's a little bit trickier to fully understand. So with an experiment, it's really important, the way that I just described that, it's very important that you randomly assign your participants to the two different groups. So we start out with 100 participants, 50 of them are going to get the SSRI, 50 of them are going to get the new medication. I have to make sure that whether you end up in the SSRI condition or the other condition is completely random. So people don't get to choose which group they go in. I don't get to choose. Maybe I just have a list of my participants with like a number that's assigned to them, and I do like a random number generator, and the first half on that list goes in one group, the first half goes in the other group. So if you do that properly, and if you have a big enough sample, then ideally any other variable you can think of that might affect depression should kind of equalize between the two groups. So you might find that one group improves, the other one doesn't. And maybe you could make the argument, okay, well the group that improved, maybe they were exercising more or something like that. But if you've randomly assigned them, you have 50 random people in one group, 50 in the other group, then on average, they should be exercising probably about the same amount because there's no reason that the people who exercise more should end up in one group if you've done it randomly. Does that make sense? And then you could apply that to any other variable you could think of. It should kind of erase or average out any of those other variables that could affect the study. So then that takes care of that problem. So then you can determine, okay, if this group improves more, and I've done random assignment and all these other things, then that means that my medication is causing these depression symptoms to improve. So with an experiment, you can answer causality, you can determine that. Again, that's all assuming that it's set up correctly and that it's done well, which sometimes it isn't. So strengths and weaknesses of experiment and correlation are basically opposites of each other. The strength of experiment is that you can determine causality or causation, but the weakness is that, again, oftentimes, especially in psychology, it's either unethical or impractical to do an experiment, depending on what you're looking at. Any questions about correlation versus experiment? Okay. I think we've got just a couple more slides and then we'll get into kind of an activity. So one of the last things I want us to kind of think about as we're thinking about research in psychology are the ethics that we need to consider. I've already kind of touched on that a little bit. But first, let's kind of look at some of the history of unethical research practices that have happened in psychology. And I'm kind of starting here post-World War II. So prior to World War II, there weren't really a lot of regulations on research that use human subjects, which is almost always going to be in psychology, or it could be like in the medical field. We're doing research with human participants. So prior to World War II, there weren't a lot of rules about it. Then World War II happened, and there were a lot of really atrocious things that happened in the name of psychology and medicine. So people who, tortured people in concentration camps sometimes would use research as an excuse. They would say, we're doing these things to try to study, how this will affect their psychology or their health. So we're doing it for research purposes. So after World War II, there were all kinds of regulations that were like, you cannot do that in the name of research. It's not allowed. It's not okay. And so there were lots of rules that were made to try to make research more ethical. But still, there were quite a few issues in psychology even after that. So these are some examples of experiments that just kind of illustrate some of the issues we had in psychology kind of post-World War II. Around the 1950s and 60s is when most of these were happening. So the first one is called the Milgram shock experiment. Have any of you ever heard of this one? Okay. So with Milgram shock experiment, basically what they did, the researcher had participants come into this room that was kind of split into two. There was like this glass partition in between one side and the other. And the participant was told that there would be another participant on the other side. But actually that person is what was called a confederate. A confederate is someone who's like part of the research, but the participant doesn't know that. So they're kind of like acting like they're a participant, okay? So the real participant is told that they have to give, I'm trying to remember exactly what the stimuli was, it doesn't really matter. I think it was like word pairs or something. So they're supposed to read off these word pairs to the confederate, and the confederate is supposed to like repeat them back, but it gets like progressively harder, like they have more and more word pairs that they're supposed to remember or whatever. The participant is told that if the confederate gets it wrong, they're supposed to shock the confederate, and they have like a little board in front of them where they're controlling the shock. And every time the confederate gets it wrong, they're supposed to amp up the voltage to make it like higher and higher. Again, it's confederate, so the confederate is not actually being shocked, but the participant doesn't know that because the confederate acts. They're like a trained actor who acts like they're being shocked, acts like they're in pain, and they're supposed to the very end, like ramp it up to the highest setting that like could potentially be deadly. They even have like a little thing on the dial that has like a warning, like if you get to this level, this could be lethal. But the whole time, the researcher is standing there in like a lab coat with a clipboard, looking very authoritative, telling the participant, just keep going, keep going. And the confederate's like screaming in pain, but the authority figure just keeps telling them, no, keep going, it's fine, we gotta finish this experiment. And the whole point of it was basically to try to see like, will people follow authority even if they're hurting another person, okay?
Was the answer yes?
Yes, unfortunately, a lot of people did what the authority figure said and would go all the way up to like the highest setting, even though the confederate is like screaming out, apparently in pain. So yes, the results were shocking, just like the experiment itself. Yeah, Emmy.
I learned about it because in middle school I was learning about like her behavior, and I was doing an essay on like her behavior, and that was like one of the examples we could use.
Yeah.
It was, like, you know how they listen to authority and like how that influences people's decisions.
Yes, yeah. So a lot of these studies that were done in this time, it's like, they're tricky because they told us something kind of shocking about human behavior. They gave us useful information, but they're pretty clearly very unethical. Especially because in this case, like with the Milgram shock experiment, the participants had no idea what they were getting themselves into. They didn't know that they were going to be required to hurt another human being as part of this experiment. They also obviously were being deceived throughout the entire study. They thought they were hurting someone when they actually weren't. So you can probably understand, like if you had been a participant in that study and you had been pushed to hurt another person, probably the way you feel afterward would not be great. It would be very traumatic. You would, have all kinds of issues that you would be wrestling with. Yeah.
My question is, how did they like coerce them to go into a little room if they didn't even know what they were doing?
So a lot of times, in like universities, in big universities, if you're a psych major, you often are required to some extent to participate in studies. And I believe this was probably happening at a university, and it was probably something like that, where like some psych students signed up for a study. Like they knew they were doing a study, but it probably said, we're doing a study on memory, or something like that, right? Because it's about like these word pairs that they're supposed to memorize. They weren't told this is actually a study on, are you willing to shock another human being until they're potentially gonna die? So they knew they were gonna do a study, they just had no clue the extent of what the study was gonna be. So that's one example. I hope we can all agree probably that at least the way that study was designed, not super ethical, right? Okay, what about the Stanford prison experiment? Have you guys heard about that one? That one's a little more popular. I think there's like movies or a series or something that basically depict it. For those of you who haven't seen those, kind of the gist of it is that this happened in Stanford, so that's why it's called the Stanford prison experiment. There was a researcher who was kind of interested in a similar idea, like if you give people authority, how will they treat other human beings is kind of like the question that he was asking. So he essentially got some students, I don't remember, does anybody remember how many there were? I want to say like 20 something maybe, I don't know. There was like 20 some students they recruited. Half of them or some portion of them were assigned to be guards, and the other portion were assigned to be prisoners. And they, in the basement of Stanford, actually created like a little prison, basically. They found a bunch of like closets or small rooms and that had locks on them. And they sort of put the prisoners in there and then gave the guards like authority to just kind of treat them however they wanted. And I think the study was supposed to go on for like a month or something. It ended up being shut down after like 2 weeks maybe, because it just immediately got way out of control. The guards at some point were like making, I don't even remember, some of you who watch the series might remember some of the things that happened better, but like they took away their beds, they weren't giving them a lot of food, I think they made them like wear dresses at some point. All of the participants were male in this study. They basically just like humiliated them and tortured them and did all kinds of horrible things, the guards did. And so it immediately spiraled out of control and basically was shut down. Any other details about it that you guys can remember from the series? I haven't thought about it in a long time, so I'm trying to remember if I left anything important out. But again, it was just very unethical approach to kind of answering a question. Another one was the Watson-Little Albert experiment. So this was, Watson was a behaviorist. If you remember when we talked about history stuff last time, behaviorists typically were doing stuff with like animals, but Watson actually worked a little bit with infants. And he tried to essentially condition them to develop fears of animals, like develop a phobia of small animals. So the way he did this is he had an infant that he had gotten for, I don't even know whose baby it was. I don't know what mother gave permission to him to do this, but he took this baby. He would introduce like a bunny, like this cute little fluffy bunny. And every time the bunny was introduced, Watson would like slam a hammer on this metal bar that made this really loud, abrasive, terrible noise. And so the baby would cry and scream and be scared because of the sound. And he just did that over and over again. Here's the bunny, here's the loud sound, here's the bunny, here's the loud sound, until eventually little Albert, the baby, would cry as soon as the bunny was present, wanted nothing to do with the bunny, was like terrified, trying to crawl away from it. It was horrible. So, and as far as I know, I believe that baby went on to like have a phobia of animals for probably the rest of his life. Because of this experience that he had as an infant. There's videos of that you could find if you go Google Watson-Little Albert. It's very old. Again, I think that was like 1940s or 50s or something. Very grainy, like black and white video. But it'll kind of show you what I'm talking about.
I was unaware that like he was going to be put through those. If I remember correctly, I think there's regrets on her end over like after she got her baby back.
That makes sense. That makes a lot more sense that she probably didn't know what was going to happen. It's probably similar to like the Milgram one where maybe she was told like, oh, we want your baby to be part of this study just to look at how they learn, and then it was like this horrible traumatic thing that the baby was put through.
I don't even know why a scientist would want to like try to develop that. You know what I mean? Like what has to be going through the scientist's mind to want to encourage that? Like, that just doesn't make any sense to me from like a research standpoint or anything.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
they just have to be like kind of weirdos to even want to do that.
I completely agree with you. Like to do it in the way that he did it was just like, I can't imagine thinking that would be a good idea and then like following through and doing it. I mean, he was basically trying to prove that you can condition someone to be scared of anything, which is like we don't need to do it in this way to try to support this idea. So yeah. Again, an instance where like doing a correlational study would maybe make sense. Maybe ask people, what kind of experiences have you had with animals in your childhood? Are you scared of animals now? Instead of subjecting them to this trauma just to prove that your theory is correct. It's, very crazy. For some reason too in the video, you guys should look it up just to see. I mean, it's not fun to watch, but he's like wearing this really creepy mask too, which I don't know. I don't think it's part of the experiment. I don't know why. I've still been trying to figure out like why the mask. It just makes it like extra creepy and weird. But yeah. So all of this led to a couple rules that we have now. So one rule that we have when we're doing research is that studies have to have what's called informed consent. So a participant has to know exactly what they're getting into before they enter into a study, and they have to give free consent to participate, and that consent has to be ongoing. So if at any point in time they decide the study is too much and they want to quit, even if it's the middle of the study, they're allowed to do that without any consequences or repercussions. There's some other things we'll talk about in just a second, like kind of ethical rules that came out of some of these studies. In addition to all of those, some ongoing issues that we still have today is that there are many cases of what's called data manipulation and fraud. So I don't know how much you guys know about like being a professor at a university. This is not the case here at a community college, but at like big universities, the way that professors get promoted is mostly by doing research. Like their teaching is kind of like a side gig almost. Their main thing that they do is research. That's how they get raises and get promoted to like higher levels. So it's really important for them to try to publish as many articles as they can, because that's kind of the measure of how successful they are in research. A lot of good research comes out of that system, but there are lots of cases where professors maybe feel pressured. Maybe they do some research and it doesn't turn out the way that they expected, so they're not getting things published, they're not getting promoted. So a lot of times they will, I mean, not a lot of times, but enough times that it's a problem. They will basically just manipulate their data. So they might come up with some theory and they test it. The data doesn't quite work out the way they expected. They'll just go in and change the data, just change their results to fit whatever their hypothesis was so that they can get it published. In the most extreme cases, they don't even do the study or collect the data. They just make it up fully from scratch and then get that published in a journal so that they can get their promotions and things like that.
Nobody checks that?
It's getting better. It would probably shock you to know like how little oversight there is. I mean, I did research as a graduate student, and most of the time there was nobody really checking what I was doing, or I was kind of just trusted to honor system, do the right thing and do it correctly. So yeah, there's not as much oversight as you would probably think in terms of the data. There is oversight at the beginning, which we're going to talk about in the next step. There's things you have to go through to get a study approved before you do it. But then once you're actually doing the study, collecting the data, there's often not a ton of oversight. It's getting better because there's now like open source things, which is where like you don't just publish the article that you write, but you have to actually publish your data online. Like if you have an Excel spreadsheet with all your participants' results or whatever, you have to also put that online. And then people are getting better at kind of digging through that and trying to look for, like there's certain kind of markers that will tell you if something's been just invented or if it's, manipulated in a way. So it is getting better, but still not great. We'll talk more about this. It's particularly prominent in social psychology for various reasons. So whenever we get to talking about social psychology, that's kind of towards the end of the quarter, we'll come back and talk about some specific cases and some of the issues like why it's done, etc. And then another really important ethical issue that again is kind of ongoing is that in a lot of cases, marginalized people have been excluded from psychology, both as the researchers and also as the participants. So historically, most of the people who were doing the research and most of the people who were participating in research would have been like rich white guys, essentially, because that was who was allowed to be professors and to do research and was allowed to be in universities. And so again, something that's getting better. There's more representation as far as the number of professors and who's participating, but it's still not great. There are lots of groups that are excluded or not, fully represented. Okay, last slide. So now modern research is overseen by two kind of governing bodies. There's the APA, or the American Psychological Association. They're the ones who basically make the rules about how research should be done. And then all universities or any institution that does a lot of research with human participants, they will have what's called an IRB, or an institutional review board. And the IRB is basically enforcing the rules that the APA comes up with. So if at LCC, I don't think we have an IRB because there's not a lot of research done here, but at my previous institution there was an IRB. So if I had wanted to do research there, basically what I would have to do is I would have to think about the whole design and everything first. I'd have to come up with all of my materials, like my surveys that I'm going to use, any instruments I'm going to use to measure behavior or whatever. And there's this whole lengthy application that I would have to fill out where I go into detail about what I'm going to do for my study, what's kind of the background research that's already been done, what are some of the risks that participants might run into, etc. And then there's the IRB board. Usually it's going to be 5 to 6 people. They're typically going to be faculty from lots of different areas. So there might be faculty from psychology, from chemistry, from physics, from nursing, all serving on this board. And they review those applications and basically decide if the study should be allowed to be done or not. And then they're also enforcing, so like I said, with any study you have to have informed consent. So there's an actual form that it has to have, there's very specific information that has to be on there that the participants see before they participate, and they have to sign it and give their consent. And then there are still instances in psychology where deception is allowed to some extent. So it's not anywhere near like the Milgram shock experiment. But let's say, for example, let's say I wanted to do a study on like racism, for example. Most people are probably not going to be honest about that if they are racist, right? And so a researcher might develop kind of subtle techniques to measure racism, but not tell the participants ahead of time that that's what they're looking at, because if they tell them, that's going to change their behavior, and they're going to respond very differently to the survey than they would if they didn't know what that's about, okay? So in an instance like that, deception would be allowed, but what you have to do afterwards, as soon as the study is done, you have to do what's called debriefing, where you then tell the participant, okay, this was the actual purpose of the study, this is what we were actually looking at. If you want us to remove your data from the study, now that you know that, we can do that. If you need counseling services because of some trauma you experienced, we can provide that for you for free. So there's like a debriefing that tries to help with any issues that might come out of using that deception. And anytime there is deception in the study, there's a lot more. So typically with IRB, if you're submitting an application that doesn't have any deception, it's usually going to be like 1 or 2 of the members that review it. But if you have deception, you have to do a full IRB review, which is way more lengthy. So it's like a lot more process. So it's still allowed in some cases, but there's a lot more oversight to it. I'm trying to think if there's any other specific rules that you guys should know about. I don't think so. Any questions about APA or IRB kind of ethics rules? Okay. Next thing I want to do is a little bit of a discussion, and it's related to ethics, but it's something we didn't get to. I didn't have a slide on it or anything in here, but I kind of want to talk about it. Another method that's often used in psychology, particularly in like neuroscience or biopsychology, or even with like behaviorism that we talked about earlier, is using animals to do research. And this can vary a lot. So animal studies can sometimes be very cruel. I'll give you some examples in a second. Sometimes they can be, like totally fine. Like you might just have a mouse in a cage that's living its life, not really anything happening to it, and maybe we're just measuring some very simplistic things. Some of the worst cases, so I'm going to tell you a story. This might be hard for some of you to hear, I don't know. So whenever I got my graduate degree, my PhD, I did a PhD in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. And some of the neuroscience students were looking at basically how physical trauma affects the brain. Like if you get in a car accident or something like that, how is that going to affect your brain? So they would do studies with mice where they had a name for their device, but I don't remember it. It was like this very clinical, technical sounding device, but to me it looked like a cannon, essentially, a very small cannon. They would put the mouse in the cannon and shoot it at a wall so that it would damage its brain. And then they would there were things that they would measure in their brain before and after to try to look at like how, does this traumatic impact affect some area of the brain. So that's maybe like the most extreme example of kind of animal research that's done. Like I said, at the other end, you have maybe a mouse that's just like living a cushy life in its cage with all kinds of food and things, and maybe we're just measuring like what makes this mouse happy. Those experiments do happen too, but there's also the very like traumatic ones. Trying to think of like what else you might need to know about animal research to answer some of these questions. I'll just ask you, and then we can get into it in discussion. So first of all, I just want to know like what are your thoughts in general. So also the way we're going to do this, I'm going to ask you these questions. Sit there and think about it for a minute. We'll get into small groups, like maybe up to 5, and then you can share what you've talked about with the big group after that. But kind of what are your thoughts in general about researching using animals to research human behavior? So what are your thoughts about research using animals? Particularly studies like the one I just described, where animals are injured in some way. I want you to think about, does the species of the animal matter? So I saw all your reactions when I said a mouse was launched out of a cannon. What if it was a fly, a fruit fly that we launched out of a cannon? What if it was a baby chimpanzee? Right? Does the species of the animal matter? Should it matter? What about like the significance of the possible results? So what if somehow doing that study I just described could like cure cancer? It's hard for me to imagine how that specific one could, but you get what I'm saying. If there's a study that could cure cancer, but we got to torture some animals to do it, does that change whether we should do it or not? So you can wait. So what we're going to do, I want you to think about it for a minute, and then I'm going to have you get into groups of 4 or 5, and then you can share with the whole class after you've had that small group discussion. I assume you were raising your hand because you wanted to share something, so that's why, but yeah. Okay, minute of silence, think about it. Okay, so now I'll have you get into groups, maybe like 4 or 5. Move around the room if you need to. And just talk a little bit about your thoughts